Hello everyone, once again you're watching the Beats Save the World YouTube channel. Today in this video I wanted to talk a little bit about voice types, alright? A lot of people are curious about whether they are a tenor, a baritone, a bass, a soprano, a mezzo-soprano. You know, as for how you should practice, it's really the same no matter what voice type you have, but I think a lot of people just kind of want to know, They want to know what their potential limits are later on, and they're just curious what their voice type is. And I understand that, self-knowledge I think is such a powerful thing, so if you can understand your voice type, then I see nothing wrong with that. I think it can really give you some intuition on what you'll likely need to work on a bit more, and what your strengths and weaknesses are. So let's get into it. How would if someone came to me and asked, what's my voice type? Am I a tenor? Am I a bass? Am I a soprano? There are really two areas that I would look at to make a decision. We don't have an exact cutoff, but we can get a pretty good idea of what voice type you are by looking at these two things. Okay, number one, the tone quality of your low notes, all right? That's where I would start. If someone is wondering what voice type they are, then first I would look at the tone quality of their low notes. And it's not necessarily whether they can get low notes, because, even if you have a higher voice type, with practice, you can kind of blend your voice with vocal fry and get some pretty impressive low notes. For reference, not necessarily impressive low notes, but you can get pretty lower than you might expect, but they won't sound like a bass baritone's low notes, okay? So for reference, my voice type, I am a lyric tenor, okay? So there are so a tenor is a higher male voice, and then there are different types of classifications within that. So as for tenors, there are dramatic tenors, which are like the lower, kind of darker ones that still have some of the freedom of a higher voiced male. There are the spinto tenors, which spinto means pushed, okay? A spinto tenor still has some of that dramatic, darker quality, but more flexible. And then you have the lyric tenors, which are more flexible than a spinto. They have kind of a lighter tone quality. Think like Chester Bennington from Linkin Park. And then, you can apply those kinds of words to baritones as well. You could have a dramatic baritone, which would be like darker in tone. You could have a lyric baritone, which is like almost a tenor, but not quite. And we're going to kind of get into seeing where you fit. So I was saying that I am a lyric tenor, which is a higher voice and even high compared to other tenors for the most part. So the first thing I would look at to classify someone is the tone quality of their low notes, because even if you can get down pretty low by combining with vocal fry, it won't sound like a real baritone, okay? So let's use me as an example. Watch, I can combine my normal voice with vocal fry to get some... They don't sound like bass notes, but they're technically the same note. Let me show you. Like if I go... right? Now you're like, is that even a note? This is what I'm talking about. When you hear that kind of sound in the lower register, like when someone is trying to sing low notes and the sound that's coming out is like, yeah, it may even be clear what the note is. Like you might even be on pitch. I probably wasn't, but you might even be on pitch singing those notes. But the key is they have that frying tone quality, and that's indicative of being a tenor, okay? If your low notes sound like they're not real and they're like a cross between normal and vocal fry, that's an indication that you have a higher voice type. We'll get into the women in a second. Right now I'm talking about male voice types, like tenor versus baritone. So if your low notes, like a good place to start is like around G2 or like F2, that kind of area. So something like, if I were to go for a G2, it's something like, you hear that fry on top? Like I'm getting the G2, and then we go for like an F. I mean, I might be a little sharp, but I'm mostly getting the note. But the reason why, if I listen to that, I'd say that's a tenor, is because the quality of the note is not the same as a mid-range note, okay? You hear that kind of frying quality on top. It sounds kind of thinner. It sounds tight. It sounds like, it has this tight quality. It's not relaxed. And the reason that's the case is because the way I'm getting those notes is that I'm adding more compression to my vocal cords as I go down. So I'm gradually turning, if I stay on the same note, what I'm doing as I go lower is I'm going, I'm adding more of that. Because I need more compression for the note to even be audible, and that's how I'm going. But I'm not a baritone or a bass because you can hear those notes are not clear. If I were a true baritone or bass, the low notes would have more of the tone quality of like, instead of, hear the difference? Like the, it has a vocal fry on top of it, and that shows that I'm artificially kind of getting there. So by looking at, if you're trying to classify a man, by looking at the notes around G2, around F2, that kind of area, if they're struggling with those notes, G2 and F2, and like they might be able to get them, but if they have that frying tone quality, I'd say they're a tenor, okay? So even if you can get the notes around G2 and F2, if they have that kind of tone quality instead of sounding more round, I'd say you're a tenor. Now, how do you know if you're actually a bass? So if you decide you're not a tenor, are you a bass? Well, if you're a bass, I'd say you should be able to get all the way down to like a D2 or like even a C2 without having to fry the crap out of it, okay? So if I attempt a C2, I don't even know if I could like get it to be even a note, but let me see, like my pitch wasn't very precise, but you could hear the tone quality of that. That was around there, just not with very precise pitch. But you could hear it was so tight. It was like, that was the tone quality, right? If someone's actually a bass and not just a baritone, that note should be perfectly clear, okay? You should be able to get a C2 without it sounding like a fry, okay? And then if you can do that, you're probably a bass. So that's the first thing I look at is low notes. And then you can do a similar thing for women. If you're a woman trying to decide whether you're a soprano, a mezzo-soprano, an alto. So an alto is like a lower voice woman. A soprano is like a higher voice woman. A mezzo-soprano is kind of in between. If you're trying to decide that, I would say look at the notes around like E3. So if you're deciding, are you a soprano or a mezzo-soprano? What is the tone quality of notes around like E3? Okay, if you can get really clear notes around like E3, then I'd say you're probably a mezzo-soprano. And even if you can get the note around E3, but if it sounds like kind of, if it has that kind of tone, like women when they're in their low range, they tend to have a more whispery tone than a frying tone. They tend to sound more like that kind of thing. If you're sounding like that at around E3, you're probably a soprano. If you're an alto, you should be able to go all the way down to like a C3. Without having that kind of tone quality. So you should be able to clearly sing like a C3 if you're actually an alto. And then just you can use elimination to decide that, okay? So again, if you can get a C3 really clear, you're probably an alto. If you can't do that, but you can get like an E3, then you're probably a mezzo-soprano. And then if all of those notes sound kind of forced, then you're probably a soprano, okay? So honestly, that's my go-to method for assessing voice types. Now, the second thing that I would do is what is the actual tone quality in your mid to higher notes? Now, you can't just look at do you have high notes, because if you're like a beginner, you probably won't have belted high notes without a good amount of practice, right? So you can't just, for a man, you can't just be like, can they sing the high C? Because most tenors can't get a really good sounding high C without practicing. You know, they need to discover that part of their voice. So you know, whether they have the high C or not is not really a good test to say, are you a tenor? I know a lot of people who actually are tenors who will say, but I don't think that I am because I don't have really good high notes. I don't have like a good 4th octave. I don't have a good 5th octave, so I must be a baritone. But that's not really a good way of measuring it, because you may just need to train that part of your voice more. I'd say a better way is what I said before about the low notes, but also what is the tone quality for guys when you're in your upper 4th octave, and then for women in like the lower 5th octave, okay? Because if your tone quality is lighter, then you're more likely to be a tenor, and if it sounds heavier and darker, you're more likely to be a baritone or a bass, okay? So for me, my tone quality is much more to the edge of like Chester Bennington from Linkin Park, who is a lyric tenor. So like, listen to this. If I'm singing like, what's a good song? Like, I need you to stay, even though I told you that I would. You know, that tone quality. It has this very bright kind of like little boyish kind of sound. Whereas if you listen to Dan Reynolds from Imagine Dragons, I think that's his name, the singer of Imagine Dragons, listen to how much darker. Like if I were to imitate him, like if he's singing a song like, "Can nobody hear me?" That's just how he sounds, like so dark and heavy even without trying, you know? Whereas for me, a much more natural sound is to sound lighter. So in your upper fourth octave for guys, if you sound way heavier, like you sound more like Dan Reynolds, you're more likely to be a baritone or a bass, I would say. And then if you have this kind of light Chester Bennington, kind of more youthful kind of sound, you're more likely to be a tenor. I remember when I was kind of recording some stuff with my voice, even though when I was doing this in this particular story, I was like already like 22 or something, people who were listening to this were saying like, "Oh, it sounds like you're younger than the original singer." But actually I wasn't, you know? I was like singing this cover of Man in the Box or something by Alice in Chains, and then, you know, people were listening to it and they're saying, "Well, you sound younger than the original singer." But actually I wasn't, you know? Actually, I mean, maybe I was by a bit, but like we were around the same age, I believe, of like when Lane Staley recorded Man in the Box versus when I recorded that version. But if you sound younger, that's kind of a tenor thing, is to sound really, you can sound powerful, but you have more of a boyish quality is what I was saying. And then for women, of course, if you have kind of a more feathery, kind of lighter tone, you're more likely to be a soprano. And then, you know, check this in like the lower fifth octave. And if you have like a darker, heavier sound like Jennifer Hudson or something, then you're more likely to be like an alto or to be a mezzo-soprano, okay? And then depending on just how dark you are versus how light you are, darker being like, you know, this kind of sound, this is what I mean by like a darker sound, and then lighter being like, "Hey, what's up?" And for reference, I'm a lighter voice, so I sound like this, right? That's what a lighter voice sounds like. And then Dan Reynolds would be an example of a darker voice, and Jennifer Hudson would be an example of a darker voice for women, okay? So hopefully that gives you some light onto trying to decide what your own voice type is. I hope that this was helpful. I hope you learned something. I encourage you to make the most of your voice type. You know, no matter what type you have, I'm sure you can expand your range. You know, you can probably do some amazing things if you practice hard enough. So let me know what you think in the comments. Feel free to like the video and subscribe, and have an amazing day. Talk to you next time.